おはようございます。今日も朝のHoudini作業配信をやっていきたいと思います。今日は、ファインドじゃないか。ショーテストパスを使った作例をやっていきたいと思っています。動画自体は昨日のパッチ、スティッチ表現のやつを投稿してた人と同じ人の別の作例なんですが、結構この人説明が分かりやすかったのと、英語も割と聞き取りやすくて良いなと思ったので、ちょっと昨日に引き続き同じ人でやっていきたいなと思ってます。はい。では、動画を流していきます。
We're going to direct shortest paths through an arbitrary mesh. On the left side you can see the most direct path, which is meeting up here at the furthest distance. Then in the second variant you can see that we are adding a bit of additional cost using noise, so it's not quite as predictable. And then the third variant shows we are directing the paths on the outer surface as long as possible, and then in the very last moment we're diving inside to meet the target. So let's start with a new Houdini scene.
といったような感じのものを作っていきたいと思います。それはHoudiniに切り替えて、昨日Houdiniのバージョンが動画の方が最新だったのもあって、使えないノードがあったので、今回は 18.5 なんですけど、今後はちょっとできるだけ合わせていった方が良いなと新しいものに関しては合わせていこうかなと思ってます。古いのに関しては古いバージョン切り替えたりとかでなんとかできるんですが、はい、というわけでやっていきます。
And I'm going to use the template head as my reference mesh. It's open on the bottom, so let's fill it with polyfill.
おかしい。
And you can see these polygons are a bit distorted, so let's switch to quadrilateral grid, which has a bit of deformation, so let's just save this so it's flat. And next I want to scale my object to unit size using match size. So we say scale to fit uniformly, and we want to justify the Y, so the minimal vertical position will be sitting right on the floor.
コード使ったら結構簡単にスケール合わせられるのか。 これアラインか。ジャスティファイだから。ゼロにするってことか。だからこっちがスケールフィットだから111の中にしてくれるってこと。これはいいな。で、2にしたらゼロ合わせにしてくれると。
Next, we want to fill this hollow model, because if you clip it, you will see that there's nothing our paths could grow on. There is no internal mesh, there are no points, there's no volume, there's nothing our paths could walk along. So we need to fill this with TED embed. TED embed will place lots of tetrahedra inside. You can see this if you connect this to the clip node, that there are lots of three-sided pyramids inside now, and their size varies a bit. Let's define the max TED scale to 0.03, and the outer surface has varying triangles, and we will set them to the same value as well. So these are plenty of edges our paths can grow along, so this would be something we can work with. I do not need the clip any longer. This was just for demonstration purposes. So we want to define a few start points and also some random targets all the way through the tetrahedra points. So with a group expression,
ゴーストになるんだ。スマスシェーデッドだと、結局同じようなゴーストなんだな、ショートカットは。ゴーストであるな。
we can define a point group called start, and we would define this just based on the height. In a more sophisticated setup, we could also refer to the bounding box, but I think it's sufficient to just say if you're slightly above the ground using the position vector, y component, smaller than a very small number, this would be the start. And then we have an end group, which we can visualize best by disabling the start group for a second. And we will just use a preset called
小さい。ああ、微妙にはみ出てるのか。うん、なるほど。
This would be the start, and then we have an end group, which we can visualize best by disabling the start group for a second, and we will just use a preset called 30% chance. And in order to customize this a little bit, we will set the channel integer to seed, so we get a slider for varying the endpoints, and also the chance should be definable, so you can just say channel flow chance, so this would be like a percentage slider. In case you would need more seed values, you could just dive inside the edit parameter interface and set, you could just
こっちになったら全部選択されて、なるほど。
In case you would need more seed values, you could just dive inside the edit parameter interface and set their integer to 1000 and hit accept. But in this case, you will hardly notice. What's more important later on will be the density of the tetrahedra. So this value, max tet scale, is something you would hardly notice. What's more important later on will be the density of the tetrahedra. So this value, max tet scale, is something you would want to either make smaller or larger depending on the structure you want. I'll keep it at 0.03 for now though. Next.
変わってる？変わってる。
Let's use the shortest path. And what's more important later on will be the density of the tetrahedron. Next, let's
しか作られてないってことか。
use the shortest path node, which is doing the main job. So you would say from start to end, and in case you're missing the start group, just make sure we have activated it again. So now we can say start to end, and now it's just starting at
スタンドあるよね。プリミティブになってんのか。で、スタート、エンドか。
to end.
うんうん。
And now it's just starting at the few start points we had, and it's ending at the closest end it can find. What we want instead is we want to go from any start to each end. So we don't care about where we start, but we should make sure we really reach each end. And this is how we get this tree-like structure.
全部に対して。
Make sure to display the points so you can see that it's still a bit rough, but it's doing the overall job. Now, what may be more interesting is how to make this smooth without having to calculate too many connections, and this is usually done with the resample node. Especially if you set the length to a very small number and hit treat polygon as subdivision curves, you will see that we now get a very smooth result. But something is worth noting, which is there are many curves using the same edges. So this is why we get this bundled. See that?
スポットビュー。
If we scale down the explode, you see that there are lots and lots of curves on top of each other. In order to filter them, you could use a fuse node.
何してんの。何してんの。でしょう。大きくね。中心から外側に向かって押し出します。ああ、そういうことか。フラクチャーのデバッグ用のノードだと思ってたけど、そういうことじゃねえんだな、これ。その性質を使ってデバッグしただけなのか。このプリミティブ単位に作用する。
On the explode, you see that there are lots and lots of curves on top of each other. In order to filter them, you could use a fuse node. And a polypath. It depends on the look you want to achieve, but generally speaking, this will avoid having the same issue. No, so now you can see these are really individual pieces. And the resample node is still making sure this is looking smooth, but please feel free to experiment.
こで、変わったのか。で、そっか、今度ショーテストパスで、全部に対して同じように線を出してるから、同じ道を通ることもあるのか。パスで、ちゃんと分かってる。ガーブのトポロジーをクリア。なるほど。クリアだから、あんまり目に見えるもんでもない。すぐ変わんないもん。なんかエッジをきれいにしてくれてるみたいな認識でいいのか。
These are really individual pieces. And the resample node is still making sure this is looking smooth, but please feel free to experiment with not fusing it or not using the poly path, as the results will differ. Smooth, but please feel free to experiment with not fusing it or not using the poly.
頂点変わってんのか。おかしなやつとか綺麗なエッジにしてくれてるみたいなことなのかな。
Poly path, as the results will differ. I think I will keep it on for now, and I would like to add some interest. We want to put a hole in there, so we go all the way back to the tetrahedra and ask for their distance to, let's say, a line. Which is going horizontally through the head. So set the direction accordingly. step back by a unit and double the length, and we will just position it a bit upwards so it's going right through. And if you want to have it horizontally from left to right, you would just switch values. Now you could simply say distance from geometry, and it should return a distance
なんか分かってきた。これを使って頭に花をぶち開けるのか。
for each point, which is treated as a tetrahedra geometry, and it should return a distance for each point, which is treated as a tetrahedra, or the other way around. The tetrahedra are basically displayed as points. So in order to blast them, you would just put points as the group and say add dist smaller than a certain threshold, and in this case I will use 0.15, so that way I have this whole. If we now connect it back to our group node,
なるほどね。ちょっと待って、こいつがリストを作るんだよね。一緒に入れると、ああ、なるほど。こんな綺麗に開くんだ。
and all the others, we get this structure. And now what's interesting is it's using the shortest path, but it's doing this in a mathematically perfect way, so they all end up in the furthest distance, or at least some of them, and we get this gap. Now in order to mix this up, you could go back before the shortest path and mess with the point cost attribute. So this is, or can be, an additional attribute. I will just use an attribute noise for that and set it to float and call it cost path. So this can be set to 0 centered, so it can be plus or negative. The amplitude and the element size are what is most interesting. If you want to visualize this quickly, you could set it to CD for a second and just activate the node, so you will see
アドモノン、あ、そっか、今カラーノード、カラーのアトリビュートがないからか。そうすると、そうだよね。 されて、0センターってなんだっけ。最初はね、散々打ちないです。サンプリチュードからサンプリチュード。ああ、そういうことか。マイナスが入ってるってことではない。でもあ、そうだよね。0.77 からマイナス0.77って。
That the amplitude is basically the strength and the element size is the frequency. So this would be, I think, chaotic enough. And I will put the name cost underscore path in it again. Now see what the find shortest path is doing when I paste this cost underscore path, and all of a sudden it is getting mixed up. It doesn't really have or it has additional costs, so it has to choose different paths. This is way too extreme, so it doesn't really see what the find shortest path is doing when I paste this.
パス
cost underscore path, and all of a sudden
アトリビュートのやつでポイントで作ってる。ポイントコストアトリビュートか。アトリビュートじゃなくて、ポイントの方か。こうとか。
path in it again. Now see what the find shortest path is doing when I paste this cost underscore path, and all of a sudden it is getting mixed up. It doesn't really have or it has additional costs, so it has to choose different paths. This is way too extreme, so you would reduce the amplitude. So that way it would be more similar to what we had before. Not quite as chaotic, but still really mixed up. Now this is not what we're going to use in the end. What I found or find more interesting is the distance towards the initial surface. So just like before, we are going to use a distance from geometry node. and refer back to the match size where we had the unit size mesh.
サイズからか。
Back to the match size where we had the unit size mesh, this one. Maybe I display it like this. And the distance from the tetrahedra to the mesh is now stored as dist, and I can call this dist SRF for surface. That way we do not overwrite the old attribute. Now the distance to the surface ranges from minus 0.2 up to 0.1. And this is something we should remap with an attribute remap. Of course, this is not procedural, but for the time being, we could say minus 0.1 up to positive 0.1. And we want to change the output, or to have a bit of an easier way of changing it, we will use the ramp and set this to, well, I think it's sufficient to keep it that way. We don't need the ramp actually. Just flip it from 1 to 0. Now, this attribute is the dist surface, and in Instead of using the noise, we will just tell the shortest path to use this. And now you will see that all the paths are running on the outside.
そう。オブジェクトに沿うようになるってことか。
And in the very last moment, they will dive in. So especially once it's resampled, this will look quite interesting, I think. And again, if you want to change the resolution later on and want this to be denser, we can still refer back to the TED embed. Now, what's still missing is a way to affect the thickness of these paths. So we should use the curve view attribute in there and map them to a point scale.
ここになかったっけ？選んでるのとが違うじゃねえか。
So we hit attribute remap and say curve view will be turned into p scale. So curve view is an attribute that starts at the beginning of a curve with 0 and goes all the way up to 1. And now the p scale can be used inside either a sweep, the beginning of a curve,
あれ？おかしい。なんでこんなのになる？ なんで赤になるんだ。自分がバラバラじゃん。ああ、だよね。0から1までになってて、なんで赤になるんだろう。でもしょうがないし。そうだね。赤だからこっちに全部伸びる。やっぱ絡んだ。地方向が言うなのか。こっちがプラス。こっちがマイナス。こっちが0でいいのか。先に向かってポイントスケールが小さくなるってことは逆な気がするな。グレート。まあいいか。いや、進めよう。
with 0 and goes all the way up to 1. And now the P scale can be used inside either a sweep or in a VDB from particles. So this is using or multiplying on the P scale attribute, and we should of course set the mapping to a very, very low value. Reverse it and lift up the tip.
ここで逆転させるのか。
Reverse it and lift up the tip.
で0にならないようにしてるってこと。
Now we need a very high voxel resolution to actually see the tips, and make sure to activate the shading. So this is where the
これで VDB フロンパーティクルで太さ見れるんだ。 P スケールの。
curves currently start and end. So you see the polypath is basically splitting up these curves, which is something we do not want in our case. We want them to start all the way at the beginning. We do not care about them running twice or 3 or 4 times at the same edges. We rather want them to run all the way from start to finish. Reason they are not appearing in the end is because the voxel field cannot cover So you could change the minimum radius to 1.
あ、そっか、頭が電車からダメだ。なるほど。
And also make sure that the voxels are small enough to display these points. This plays together with the point scale, so if you make this slightly larger, then we'll have a better chance of coming through here. Also, the resample node should be really, really fine. Here. Also, the resample node should be really, really fine. I don't think it takes too much performance, so that way now our model is more complete. Now let's experiment with the density. You would go back and say tet embed. Let's see what it looks like when we make it smaller. Now there are more edges and potentially more ways of getting from A to B, and also the outer surface should get more detail if you like. It's not necessary. So this is what it looks like now. And this right now is a voxel model. So there are ways to shade this, but the usual way would be to convert it back to a polygonal mesh. So we'll get lots of triangles, and also the model is not triangles but these quads, and you see it also shrunk a bit. If you would like to compensate for this, because otherwise you may lose some detail at the tips, then you could add a bit of ISO value there, and then the signed distance field that used to be this at the tips, then you could add a bit of ISO value there. And then the signed distance field that used to be ISO value there, and then the signed distance field that used to be this voxel model will be interpreted a bit differently, and the ISO surface shifts towards the outside. Now, depending on your use case, it makes sense to remesh the entire model. I do not connect this node. I will instead first set it to a very low edge size. Also make sure to save the file. So you would edge size, also make sure to save the file. So you would just call it maybe growth or whatever you would like to name it. And now let's connect the quad mesh to our
一回保
hopefully
存してからやっとくと。
triangulated remeshed version. You can see here it will take a while.
保存してからやると
For
怖い。
prototyping, I would suggest you always work on the VDB from particles node, so that way you can judge the output. And then only when you're finalizing it, you would look at the remeshed version. All right, this is my model. And there were also discussions about how to texture this. So you would usually refer back to the input curve. So you would use the curve view attribute as you.
完全に固まった。あ、来た来た来た。綺麗になったね。はいはいはい。
component, and the angle this outer surface has towards the input curve would be the V component. So that way you can get texture coordinates. I will put a link in the description where to find a VEX snippet for this, or a shader solution for Mantra. But for the time being, this would be it, and thank you for watching.
なるほど。うん。一旦動画は終わりました。はい、結局このポリパスが何の役割を果たしたのかわからねえな。なかなかいろいろ勉強になる感じでした。マッチサイズはかなりいいっすね。やっぱりプロシージャーにモデリングしててもスケールがなんか合わないとうまくやっぱりモデル切り替えるだけってわけにはいかないんで、なんかこういうものをパッと作りたいみたいななんかサブネット化したときにスケールとか合わさないと多分ぐちゃぐちゃになることものによってはあるんで、毎回これをかますとある程度スケール揃えられるからプリセット的に使いやすいなっていうのはいいですね。で結局中までピクセル化してたの、テトラヘドロン化してたの、表面だけか。でも切った時に普通に面貼ってくれてたから面を貼る機能もあったってことなのかな。中の体コストレインとかと中になんか貼ったりするから。で、ジオメトリーで。これ結構割と簡単に穴ぶち開けられてて、おおってなりました。で、グループ化して、これで外のメッシュからの距離を測って、 れを反転してリマップして、今度小テストパスのコストアトリビュートに突っ込むみたいなことをコストアトリビュートがいまいちわかんないな。で、終了点までの、これが、このスタートポイントから、このスタート。それぞれのエンドにたどり着く。だから、1からスタート2エンドにすると、1、各スタートポイントから全部エンドにたどり着く。これが一番返し点と2の終了点。コストが低いパスがそう。コストが低いってのは近いってことなのか。計算処理的に早く見つかったってことか。近いとこではないのか。返し点ごとに対して一番重いのか。スタートは2のエンドにたどり着く。2のスタートは、どっか適当にエンドにたどり着く。これ何もねえんだ。これが一番コストが低いところに行くからこんだけしかない。 まあ一番多いよね。返し点ごとに対して指定した返し点と終点値があります。終了点の数は開始点の数と、そうなんだ。使えないってことね。スタートレビューとか。累積コスト。各ポイントに対してのコストを累積していくってことか。これが、出場エントリー上に指定したポイントと加算されることによって、いまいちわからんな、やっぱり。ちょっと後で復習だな。で、今回は、このファインドショーテストパスを、の使い方が、メインだったかなって感じですね。で、それを使うにあたって、どんなスタートとかエンドを用意するかみたいな。まだこの辺の割合とかを変えれば、もっともっとここの数がブワーっと増えていく。ゴールが増えるんで、ブワーっと増えたりとかするみたいですね。やっぱこのポリパスはなぜ使われてるのか本当にわからなかったな。ここまでの挙動を見る限りほとんど変わんねえんだけどな。TV 化した時にめちゃめちゃ違いが出るんだよな。なんでこうなるのか。ストレートエッジ。これはこれ。これのヒットはそんな変わらないんだ。繋がらなくなるのか。なるほど。このコインとポ ポイントコストアトリビュートがちょっとな、もうちょっと調べないとわからないな。で、あとは、ラインをポリゴン化してるって感じですね。あと、このエクスプロードビューを挟んだ理由もちょっとよくわからなかったな。P スケールのはい。というわけで、今日の作例はこんな感じでした。レンダリングは後でやっておこうと思います。はい。今日もご視聴ありがとうございました。